In the hushed, gleaming corridors of St. Catherine's Medical Center, a sanctuary of prestige and privilege, the air carried a serene stillness that masked the undercurrents of tension. Rippling beneath its polished surface, the hospital stood as a beacon of excellence, its walls adorned with subtle elegance, soft ambient lights casting a warm glow, pristine floors reflecting the meticulous care poured into every detail. For the wealthy and influential who sought its services, it was a haven of comfort and exclusivity. Yet, within this carefully curated world, a darker truth festered, one woven from prejudice and the quiet abuse of authority. Clara Thompson lay in one of the private suites, her body heavy with exhaustion, but her spirit alight with a fragile, radiant joy. Her newborn son rested in her arms, his tiny chest rising and falling with the gentle rhythm of new life. She traced the curve of his delicate face with her eyes, marveling at the perfection of his small, grasping fingers curling around her thumb. Clara was no stranger to struggle. As a nurse, she had spent countless nights tending to others, her hands steady even when her heart wavered. Motherhood had been a dream she'd fought for through years of quiet perseverance, and now, holding her son, she felt a gratitude so deep it bordered on pain, a bittersweet ache that pulsed with love and disbelief. Beside her stood David, her husband, his presence a steady anchor in the storm of her emotions. His broad shoulders carried the weight of a man who had clawed his way up from nothing, his dark eyes softening as they met hers. A hospital administrator with a reputation for fairness, David had earned his place at St. Catherine's through grit and compassion, a man who believed in the sanctity of care for all. To him, this hospital was more than a workplace site, was a mission, a promise he'd made to himself long ago when he'd started as a lowly assistant, vowing to protect its values. But not everyone shared David's vision. Beyond the doorway, in the shadowed stretch of the hallway, Dr. Gerald Whitman adjusted his immaculate white coat with a deliberate flick of his wrist. His movements were precise, almost mechanical, as if every gesture reinforced the authority he wielded like a scepter. Tall and lean, with sharp features and a gaze that could cut through steel, Whitman was a figure of reverence and dread. He hailed from a lineage of physicians, each generation steeped in privilege, their legacy a mantle of superiority he wore with unwavering pride. To him, St. Catherine's was not merely a hospital, it was his kingdom, a domain where he dictated who belonged and who did not. His career had been built on catering to the elitesinators, celebrities, tycoons, and he reveled in the exclusivity that defined the institution. So when his eyes fell on Clara, a woman he deemed beneath the sanctity of this space, a flicker of disdain ignited within him, burning hotter with every passing second. He stepped into the room, his polished shoes clicking against the tile with a rhythm that seemed to mock the quiet intimacy of the moment. Clara looked up, her breath catching as she met his gaze, a cold, unyielding, and laced with something venomous. "You people," he began, his voice low and dripping with contempt, "always expecting the world to bow at your feet." The words slithered from his lips, sharp and deliberate, as he scanned her with a look that stripped away her dignity. "Do you honestly believe a suite like this was meant for someone like you?" His lips curled into a sneer, a twisted parody of a smile. As he watched the light in her eyes falter, Clara's chest tightened, confusion and shame warring within her. She pulled her son closer, her arms trembling as she shielded him from the chill of Whitman's presence. What had she done to earn this scorn? Why did her very existence seem to offend him so deeply? Fear coiled in her gut as his gaze shifted to the child, his expression darkening into something sinister. "A woman like you in a place like this," he murmured, almost to himself. "Must be some kind of error. But don't worry, you'll see to it that it's fixed." With that, he turned on his heel and strode out, leaving behind a silence that felt like a noose tightening around her heart. Hours later, exhaustion claimed Clara, pulling her into a restless slumber. She dreamt of her son's soft coos, the warmth of his body against her suit. A sudden, hollow quiet yanked her awake. Her arms, once full of life, now clutched only the thin, sterile sheet of the hospital bed. Panic surged through her, sharp and electric, as she bolted upright, her breath ragged in her throat. The crib beside her stood empty, its stillness a gaping wound. She stumbled into the hallway, her bare feet slapping against the cold floor, her voice breaking as she called out for help. "Where's my son? Please, someone, where is he?" The corridors, pristine and impersonal, echoed her cries, but the staff offered little solace. A nurse paused, her eyes softening with pity before darting away. An orderly shuffled past, his face a mask of indifference. Then Whitman appeared, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression a blank slate tinged with feigned surprise. "Is something wrong?" he asked, tilting his head as if her terror were a mildly curious puzzle. Clara's voice trembled, barely a whisper as she forced the words out. "Where's my son? What have you done with him?" His eyes gleamed with a chilling detachment, his response slicing through her like a blade. "Perhaps you misplaced him. Or maybe these things just happen." The hint of malice in his tone told her this was no mistake. It was deliberate, calculated, and cruel. Days bled into one another, each one stretching the void in Clara's arms into a chasm that mirrored the emptiness in her soul. She replayed Whitman's words, his smirk, the way his presence had tainted her joy. No one seemed to believe her. Nurses avoided her gaze. Administrators dismissed her pleas with practiced platitudes. But David refused to let it rest. Behind the scenes, he dug into the hospital's underbelly, his mind racing as fragments of suspicion began to coalesce into a horrifying picture. He pored over records late into the night, his hands shaking as he uncovered whispers of Whitman's prejudicial quiet, insidious policy that had festered for years. The doctor had targeted women like Clara, mothers from modest backgrounds, women he deemed unworthy of St. Catherine's hallowed halls. They arrived with dreams cradled in their arms and left with nothing but grief, their losses buried beneath the hospital's gleaming facade. David's rage grew with every revelation. This wasn't a single act of malice, it was a pattern, a legacy of stolen lives. Other families had suffered under Whitman's watch, their newborns vanishing into the night, their cries for justice silenced by the hospital's prestige. There was Nurse Evelyn, a soft-spoken woman who had worked the night shift for decades, her hands trembling as she confided in David about the babies she'd seen transferred, without explanation. There was Mr. Hargrove, the janitor, whose weathered face crumpled as he recalled overhearing Whitman's disdainful rants about keeping the hospital pure. Each story fueled David's resolve, his love for Clara and their lost son driving him to unearth the truth, no matter the cost. Clara, too, found a fire within her grief. One gray morning, she returned to St. Catherine's, her steps steady despite the tremor in her hands. She found Whitman in his office, his back to her as he gazed out at the city below, a king surveying his realm. "You stole my son," she said, her voice low but blazing with a fury that had simmered too long. "You took him from me because you thought I didn't belong here, that I didn't deserve him. You think you're above us all." He turned, his smirk re-emerging like a shadow creeping across his face. "And what makes you think anyone would believe you?" he taunted, leaning closer, his voice thick with mockery. But before despair could swallow her, David burst in, his presence a storm of righteous anger. In his hands, he held a dossier full of falsified documents, testimonies from shattered families, a trail of evidence that could no longer be ignored. The hospital board, reluctant to tarnish their golden reputation, had no choice but to confront the truth. A tribunal convened, and Whitman's carefully constructed world began to crumble. Families stepped forward, their voices trembling but resolute, each tale of loss a dagger to his pride. The doctor, once untouchable, stood stripped of his title, his license revoked, his name reduced to a cautionary whisper. Yet, amidst the triumph of justice, a question lingered like a ghost in the room. Where was Clara's son? The victory was bittersweet, a lesson etched in paint that power, when twisted by arrogance, reaps a harvest of ruin, and justice, though hard won, demands vigilance to ensure it endures. In the sterile glow of St. Catherine's dimly lit corridors, an inexplicable disdain gnawed at Dr. Whitman, a man whose rigid sense of order defined his world. He stood motionless for a moment, staring down the hallway toward a suite reserved for the hospital's most elite patients. That Clara Thompson, a black woman he deemed unworthy, occupied such a space felt like a personal insult, a crack in the pristine facade he'd spent years upholding. It wasn't just the luxurious room that fueled his resentment, it was the audacity of David Thompson. The hospital administrator he dismissed as an insignificant upstart, daring to place her there. David, with his quiet determination and years of tireless service, had earned a respect Whitman refused to acknowledge. To Whitman, this decision wasn't a reward for dedication, it was an erosion of standards, a betrayal of the hospital's unspoken hierarchy. Whitman's polished shoes clicked sharply against the tiled floor as he intercepted a young nurse, her arms full of charts. His stern face loomed over her, his voice cutting through the quiet with a brittle edge. "Why is she in that room?" he demanded, jerking his head toward Clara's suite. The nurse faltered, her eyes darting nervously as she clutched the charts tighter. "Mr. Thompson requested it, doctor," she murmured, her tone cautious, almost apologetic. Whitman's eyes narrowed into slits, his lips curling slightly as he muttered, "Request or not, certain standards must be upheld." With that, he turned on his heel and strode away, leaving the nurse rooted in place, her unease lingering like a shadow. Inside the suite, Clara cradled her newborn son, the soft weight of him grounding her amidst the storm she sensed brewing beyond the door. The room, with its plush bedding and muted elegance, should have felt like a sanctuary, but an undercurrent of tension seeped through the walls. She brushed her fingers gently across her son's tiny forehead, watching his eyes flutter shut as she rocked him. His peace steadied her, a fragile tether to calm amid the unease she couldn't name. Beside her, David sat with a quiet strength, his presence a warm shield against the world outside. Their eyes met, and a small, tender smile passed between them, a fleeting moment of connection that held no awareness of the resentment simmering just beyond their refuge. Days slipped by in a blur of new parenthoodings at odd hours, the soft coos of their son, and the overwhelming wonder of watching him grow. Clara and David leaned into each other, their bond deepening with every shared glance and whispered hope. But Whitman's visits cast a lengthening shadow over their joy. He'd appear without warning, his tall frame filling the doorway as his gaze swept over Clara with thinly veiled contempt. His demeanor was a mascom, professional, yet edged with something cold and deliberate. Each word he spoke dripped with a dismissive bite, shrinking Clara's presence in her own space. She felt a keen lithe way his tone stripped her down, as if her very existence in that room offended the sanctity of his carefully curated domain. One evening, as the hospital settled into a hushed stillness, Clara overheard a fragment of conversation that pierced her fragile calm. Whitman stood just outside her door, his voice low but sharp, speaking to a nurse whose silhouette barely moved. "It's a disgrace. Really how standards have crumbled. This isn't what St. Catherine stands for," he said, his indignation slicing through the air. The nurse mumbled something indistinct, her discomfort palpable. But Whitman's resolve was a wall of icy unyielding, impenetrable. Clara's face burned as the words sank in, a molten mix of anger and shame twisting through her. Her hands tightened around her son, as if his small, warm body could anchor her against the humiliation threatening to swallow her whole. The joy she'd clung to darkened, tainted by the bitter sting of Whitman's disdain. David, meanwhile, moved through his days oblivious to the depth of Whitman's malice. He threw himself into his work, balancing the hospital's endless demands with the quiet thrill of fatherhood. To him, St. Catherine's was a beacon of healing, a place where compassion reigned and every soul mattered. The notion that someone, let alone a senior doctor, could harbor such venom toward his family was a possibility he hadn't yet dared to entertain. His trust in the institution was unshaken, a steady faith built on years of service and belief in its mission. But late one night, as Clara drifted between sleep and waking, her son nestled close. A faint creak jolted her senses. The door eased open, and in the dim light, she saw Whitman standing at the foot of her bed. His face was eerily calm, almost serene, but his iced host calculating. Invasive ice locked onto her child with an intensity that sent a shiver racing down her spine. "Resting well, Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, his voice soft yet threaded with a strange, unsettling undertone. Clara's heart hammered as she forced a nod, her throat too tight to speak. "Good, good. You should sleep while you can," he added, the words hanging in the air like a cryptic warning. Then he turned and slipped out, the door clicking shut behind him. Clara clutched her son closer, a primal instinct screaming to protect him from whatever lurked behind Whitman's composed exterior. Exhaustion eventually dragged her into a restless slumber, but the foreboding clung to her like damp fog. When morning broke, the room felt wrong, to still, to empty. Clara's eyes snapped open, and her breath caught as she reached for her son's crib. It was bare, the tiny blanket crumpled and cold. Panic surged through her, a wild, clawing terror as she tore through the suite, searching every corner. Her bare feet hit the floor, and she stumbled into the hallway, her voice breaking into desperate cries for help. "Where's my son? Please, Simeon." The echoes bounced off the sterile walls, met only by the hesitant glances of nurses and doctors. Their eyes held sympathy, but their movements were slow, devoid of urgency, as if her pain were a distant curiosity. Then Whitman emerged from the end of the corridor, his presence looming like a storm cloud. His face was a mask of indifference, his head tilting slightly as he watched her unravel. "Is there a problem, Mrs. Thompson?" he asked, his voice cool and measured, a stark contrast to the chaos tearing her apart. Her hands trembled as she fought to steady herself, tears burning her eyes. "Where is my son? What did you do with him?" she demanded, her voice raw and ragged. Whitman raised an eyebrow, his gaze unwavering. Perhaps he was misplaced, or perhaps some things simply aren't meant to be. The words landed like a blade, cold and precise, slicing through her hope. Clara staggered back, the world tilting beneath her as disbelief and horror crashed over her in waves. To Whitman, her agony was nothing, a fleeting inconvenience in his ordered universe. She retreated to her room, hollowed out, her chest aching with a despair that seemed to stretch into eternity. When David burst in moments later, his face etched with worry, he froze at the sight of her, crumpled, broken, a shell of the woman he'd left hours before. Her eyes met his, wide and haunted, and in that instant, he knew something irreparable had shattered. He'd always believed in the system, in the people he'd worked alongside. But the terror in Clara's gaze told a different story. Determination ignited within him, a fierce resolve to unearth the truth, no matter how deep the rot ran. David's investigation began that day, a quiet, relentless pursuit that led him into the hospital's shadowed corners. He pored over files, some reluctantly handed over by a trembling nurse named Margaret, who'd worked at St. Catherine's for decades. Her weathered hands hesitated as she passed him a folder, her voice a whisper. "Be careful, David. Some things they're buried for a reason." Through hushed conversations and hidden records, he uncovered a chilling pattern, a legacy of prejudice woven into the hospital's bones. With Whitman at its heart, what had happened to Clara and their son wasn't a fluke. It was a thread in a larger, sinister tapestry. Night after night, David sat in his office, the glow of a desk lamp illuminating the evidence he'd gathered. Clara's heartbreak had fractured him, and the absence of their son left a void that gnawed at his soul. The hospital he'd once revered now felt like a maze of deception, every hallway hiding truths he'd been blind to. He reached out to old colleagues, pulling at fragile threads of trust. Most shied away, their reluctance a silent warning, but a few like Margaret met him in secret, their stories painting a picture too dark to ignore. Whitman's influence was a web, his authority a shield for actions that defied the hospital's promise of care. As the stakes rose, David faced a daunting question. Could he bring Whitman to justice before more families suffered? Or would the doctor's power protect him from the consequences of his cruelty? This wasn't just a fight for his son, or for Clara's shattered peace. It was a battle for every soul who'd walked through St. Catherine's doors, trusting in its compassion. The lesson burned clear in David's mind. Justice wasn't a gift bestowed by the powerful. It was a fire forged in the ashes of their abuses. And as he prepared to confront Whitman, his resolve hardened, fueled by the weight of what he'd lost and the lives he might still save. On a chilly afternoon, David sat across from Margaret, a woman whose gentle demeanor belied the storm of compassion and quiet strength she carried within her. She had been his friend for years, always observing the world with a perceptive gaze and a memory that clung to every detail, no matter how small. Today, though, her usual calm was fractured. Her hands fidgeted nervously, clutching the edges of her worn coat as if it could shield her from the weight of what she was about to reveal. Her hesitation hung between them like a fragile thread, taut and trembling, ready to snap. David's heart ached as he watched her struggle. He leaned closer, his voice softening to a near whisper, laced with urgency and care. "Margaret, please," he said, his eyes searching hers. "If there's anything at all you know about Dr. Whitman, I need you to tell me." Margaret's gaze dropped, her eyes shimmering with a sorrow so deep it seemed to carve lines into her face that David had never noticed before. Her lips parted, then closed again, as though the words were too heavy to release. Her fingers tightened around her coat, knuckles whitening, and when she finally spoke, her voice quivered like a leaf caught in a bitter wind. "David, I don't know if it's my place to say," she began, her eyes darting around the dimly lit cafe to ensure no one lingered too close. "But I've seen things that have haunted me for years. Patients, mothers, whole familias that'd come into St. Catherine's with hope in their hearts, and they'd leave broken, shattered, David. And every time, Whitman was there, standing at the center of it all." A cold shiver raced down David's spine, prickling his skin as her words sank in. He leaned in closer, his breath catching in his throat, his voice dropping to a hushed, urgent tone. "Shattered? What do you mean? How?" Margaret's eyes flicked up to meet his, and for a moment, they held a flicker of fear, a silent plea for him to understand the gravity of what she was unburdening. She swallowed hard, her throat bobbing as if the truth itself was choking her. "Babies, David," she whispered, the word trembling on her lips. "Missing babies. Mothers whose children just vanished. And Whitman was always involved. He'd call it a tragic accident, or he'd twist the story, hinting that the mothers were unfit, unstable. He'd plant these seeds of doubt, these quiet, venomous lies. And those poor women they'd leave with their spirits crushed, too ashamed to fight, too humiliated to even ask why." David's pulse thundered in his ears, a wild, erratic rhythm that matched the anger surging through him, hot and untamed. His hands clenched into fists beneath the table, nails biting into his palms as he fought to keep his voice steady. "How long, Margaret?" he asked, his tone sharp with barely contained fury. "How long has this been going on?" She looked down at the scratched wooden tabletop, her shoulders slumping under an invisible burden. "Years, David," she said, her voice breaking. "Years. It's like he thinks he's got a siding who's worthy of a family, who deserves happiness. He's taken that power and twisted it into something cruel, something monstrous." Her words lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating, wrapping around David like a vice. This wasn't just about his own son anymore. This was a sprawling web of pain. Countless lives torn apart by a man cloaked in the authority of a healer. Dr. Whitman wasn't just a doctor. He was a predator, lurking in the sterile halls of St. Catherine's, preying on the vulnerable with a smile and a scalpel. The revelation ignited something fierce in David, a blazing resolve that burned away his fear. He knew he had to confront Whitman, but charging in blindly would be a fool's errand. The next few days blurred into a whirlwind of sleepless nights and relentless determination. He pored over dusty hospital archives, his fingers trembling as he unearthed faded records that whispered of secrets long buried. He sought out the few staff members brave enough to speak, nurses with haunted eyes, and janitors who'd overheard too much, each one adding a piece to the grim puzzle. Cryptic notes scrawled in Whitman's precise handwriting surfaced, hinting at a meticulous cover-up that spanned years, a system designed to silence and erase. Every discovery fueled David's anger, but it also sharpened his focus. This was just as calling, and he would answer it. The day of reckoning arrived like a storm on the horizon, inevitable, electric with tension. David had arranged a meeting with Dr. Whitman in a small conference room at St. Catherine's, a space as cold and unfeeling as the man he was about to face. The walls were lined with stark, utilitarian furniture, the air thick with the faint scent of antiseptic. When Whitman strode in, his presence filled the room like a shadow, imposing, his steps deliberate and confident. A smirk played at the corners of his mouth, barely concealed, as he regarded David with a look of thinly veiled contempt. "Well, David," Whitman drawled, his voice smooth and mocking, "to what do I owe the pleasure of this little gathering?" His tone dripped with condescension, as if David were a child tugging at his sleeve for attention. David straightened in his chair, his spine rigid with purpose. his eyes locking onto Whitman's with a fire that refused to waver. "I know what you've done, Whitman," he said, his voice steady and cutting, each word a blade honed by truth. "I know about the mothers, the children you've stolen. You might think you're untouchable, hiding behind your title and your lies. But I promise you this ends here." Whitman's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered, folding his arms across his chest with a patronizing chuckle. "Oh, David," he said, shaking his head as if scolding a naive pupil, "you've always been so sentimental. Running a hospital isn't about coddling feelings, it's about maintaining order, upholding standards. St. Catherine's is a place of prestige, and we can't let just anyone drag it down." David's voice trembled with rage, a storm breaking free as he shot to his feet, towering over the desk between them. "Prestige," he spat, the word laced with disgust. "Is that what you call it, destroying families, ripping children from their mothers, playing judge and jury in your sick, twisted game of superiority?" Whitman's eyes narrowed, his calm facade cracking as a flicker of irritation flashed across his face. "Mind your tone, David," he warned, his voice low and edged with menace. "You might fancy yourself a hero, but all you're doing is jeopardizing your career and your wife's safety. Think about that before you push too far." The threat landed like a punch, calculated and cruel, meant to unsteady David's footing, but instead, it forged his resolve into steel. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper thick with conviction. "You're going to face consequences, Whitman. Every life you've shattered, every mother you've humiliated and robbed, they'll all have their justice. This ends now." Whitman's composure slipped, a spark of anger igniting in his eyes as he leaned back in his chair. "You don't get it, do you?" he snapped, his voice rising with a bitter edge. "This hospital doesn't need your bleeding heart or your pity for those who don't belong. St. Catherine's is for the worthy, the deserving, and you, of all people, should understand that we can't just let anyone waltz in and demand what they haven't earned." David's stomach churned with revulsion, a tidal wave of fury crashing over him as he stood taller, his shadow stretching across the room. "You disgust me," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "You've got no right to decide who belongs. Every soul who walks through these doors deserves safety, respect, care, not your judgment. You've forgotten what it means to heal. You're no doctor, you're a monster." Whitman sneered, his confidence wavering as he waved a dismissive hand. "Spare me the sermon," he retorted, though his voice betrayed a hint of unease. "The board won't buy your baseless accusations. They'll see you for what you area fool clinging to empty ideals." David's gaze held steady, a quiet strength settling over him like armor. "We'll see," he said simply, his words carrying the weight of a vow. He turned and walked out, his heart hammering with a cocktail of fear and determination. He knew the road ahead would be treacherous. Whitman's influence was a sprawling root system, tangled deep within St. Catherine's, and plenty of people were content to look the other way. But David was ready to fight, for his wife, for his son, for every mother who'd left this place with nothing but grief. Back home, Clara waited, her slender frame curled into a chair by the window, her eyes tracing the gray sky outside. Anxiety gnawed at her, a relentless ache that had taken root since their son vanished. David had shared only fragments of his mission, shielding her from the ugliest truths, but she felt the burden he carried in every strained smile, every tired sigh. That evening, he sank onto the couch beside her, his hand finding hers with a gentleness that belied the fire in his soul. "We're close, Clara," he murmured, his voice soft but threaded with a resolve she hadn't heard in months. "I can't say it'll all be over tomorrow, but I swear we'll bring our boy home. And Whitman, he'll answer for everything." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, a fragile mix of hope and anguish shimmering as she squeezed his hand, her voice barely audible. "Just bring him home, David. Bring our baby back." Weeks bled into one another, each day a step closer to the final showdown. David gathered the last scraps of evidence testimonies from mothers whose lives had been gutted by Whitman's cruelty, their voices trembling as they recounted their pain, old files yellowed with age, pulled from the hospital's depths, notes that painted a chilling picture of calculated malice. The board meeting loomed, a make-or-break moment where he'd lay bare Whitman's sins in a way no one could ignore. On the morning of the meeting, David stood before the board, his heart pounding like a war drum. The room was a sea of stern faces, men and women in crisp suits, who shifted uncomfortably as he spoke. He spread out the evidence, every story, every record, every tear-stained memory from mothers who'd trusted St. Catherine's only to be betrayed. Whitman sat across from him, his face a mask of cool detachment. But David caught the fleeting crack, a glint of fear in his eyes, a tremor in his hands. The air grew thick with tension as David's voice filled the space, steady and unrelenting. He recounted the horrors, the lives Whitman had poisoned with his arrogance, each word a hammer striking at the doctor's carefully built empire. The board members exchanged glances, their whispers a rustle of unease, their expressions shifting from skepticism to dawning horror. When David finished, a suffocating silence blanketed the room. He locked eyes with Whitman, his voice ringing clear and unshaken. "This ends now." Whitman's mask slipped further, desperation seeping through as his jaw tightened. But the board remained silent, their decision hanging in the balance like a blade poised to fall. David stepped out into the hallway, his pulse racing, his breath uneven. This wasn't the end, it was the beginning of a war. The boardroom at St. Catherine's Medical Center buzzed with a restless energy, the air heavy with unspoken questions. Across from him, Whitman sat flanked by his slick lawyer and a handful of loyal allies, their faces carved from stone. The doctor's confidence was a brittle shell now, a shadow of doubt lurking in his steely gaze. David felt the room tilting, the weight of disbelief and anger tipping toward the man who'd ruled these halls with an iron fist. Justice wasn't just a word anymore, it was a reckoning, a lesson carved in the wreckage of Whitman's abuse of power, and David would see it through, no matter the cost. David stood alone in the dimly lit conference room, his hands trembling as they brushed against the edges of a thick file, resting on the table before him. Inside were the testimonies of mothers brave, broken women who had carried their silence like a suffocating burden for years. Their words, raw and jagged with anguish, spilled across the pages, each one a cry for justice that had gone unheard until now. It had taken him months of tireless effort to coax these stories from them, to sit with them in their quiet living rooms or cramped kitchens, listening as their voices cracked with grief, their eyes glistening with tears they'd held back for too long. He'd promised them someone cared, that their pain wouldn't vanish into the void, and now, here he was, ready to lay it all bare. The heavy oak door creaked open, and the board members filed in, their faces a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Whitman's lawyer, Harris, strode in last, his polished shoes clicking against the hardwood floor, his posture radiating a smug confidence. He adjusted his tie and cleared his throat, the sound slicing through the tense stillness like a blade. "Mr. Thompson," he began, his voice smooth but edged with condescension, "you've brought us quite a collection of accusations today, claims that, frankly, border on the outrageous. My client, Dr. Whitman, is a pillar of this community, a physician whose dedication to St. Catherine's Hospital has been unwavering. And yet you come here with little more than rumors and papers that could have been fabricated by anyone with a grudge." David's jaw clenched, a muscle twitching beneath his skin as he fought to keep his composure. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, the anger simmering just below the surface. But he forced his voice to remain steady, measured. "These aren't rumors, Mr. Harris. These are real people, families who walked through those hospital doors expecting care, hope, and instead left with their lives shattered. They trusted him, and he crushed them, believing he could play God, deciding who was worthy of motherhood and who wasn't." Across the table, Dr. Whitman leaned forward, his sharp gray eyes narrowing as his lips pressed into a thin, unyielding line. The man's presence was commanding, his tailored suit and silver hair lending him an air of untouchable authority. "David," he said, his tone low and cutting, "I don't know what personal crusade you're on, but these wild allegations of yours are nothing but fiction. You've let your heart bleed all over your reason, and it's clouding your judgment." David's stomach churned, a sickening twist of fury and disgust. His hands curled into fists beneath the table, nails digging into his palms as he met Whitman's gaze head-on. The doctor's cold stare was a wall, impenetrable and dismissive, but David refused to back down. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice trembling with the weight of his conviction. "It's about the families you've torn apart, the lives you've ruined while hiding behind your title and your pristine reputation. You thought no one would dare challenge you, but that ends today." The board members shifted in their seats, their expressions flickering with unease as they exchanged quick, uncertain glances. David could feel the pressure of their scrutiny pressing down on him, the air in the room growing thick and suffocating. He knew he had to push harder, to peel back the layers of Whitman's carefully crafted facade and show them the monster lurking beneath. Taking a deep breath, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small, battered recorder, placing it on the table with a deliberate thud. "I have something you all need to hear," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "This is Margaret, a nurse who served this hospital for over 25 years. She walked away after what she saw in the maternal ward after. She couldn't stomach the nightmare any longer. She agreed to let me record her story." He pressed play, and the room filled with Margaret's voice, fragile yet piercing, like a threadbare quilt unraveling at the seams. She spoke of babies vanishing from their mother's arms, of women left sobbing in sterile hospital beds, their pleas ignored. She described Whitman's icy detachment, the way he'd stride through the ward with a clipboard in hand, his decisions delivered with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel, each one slicing through a family's future. She recalled the way he'd sneer at mothers he deemed unworthy, his words dripping with contempt as he stripped them of their dignity. "I couldn't stay." Margaret's voice quavered, heavy with regret. "I couldn't watch him destroy them anymore." When the recording stopped, the silence was deafening, a void that swallowed every breath in the room. Harris shifted in his seat, his earlier swagger replaced by a nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth. David turned to Whitman, his eyes burning with resolve. "How much longer are you going to pretend, Whitman? You intimidated these women into silence, but you can't bury the truth forever. These are real lives, people you've crushed with your arrogance, your twisted sense of superiority." Whitman's face shifted, the mask of calm he'd worn so effortlessly beginning to fracture. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest, and a smirk crept onto his lips, a hollow, mocking twist that seemed to taunt the very air around him. "David," he drawled, his voice thick with disdain, "you're drowning in your own sanctimony. You think you're some gallant savior, riding in to rescue these so-called victims? Let me enlighten you. Hospitals like St. Catherine's have a legacy to uphold, a standard of excellence. We can't just fling the doors wide open to every sob story and expect to maintain our prestige." David's breath caught in his throat, disbelief surging through him like a tidal wave. "Standards?" He spat, his voice rising despite his efforts to rein it in. "You call tearing families apart a standard? Deciding who gets to be a parent based on your own warped judgment, though? Dare you dress that up as anything noble?" Harris reached out, placing a cautionary hand on Whitman's shoulder, but the doctor shrugged it off, his face twisting with fury. "You know nothing, David," he snarled, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You think everyone who stumbles into this hospital deserves the same. You're a fool blind to the reality. There are people who drag this place down, and it's my duty to keep that from happening." David's fists tightened, his knuckles whitening as he struggled to hold himself together. The board members were watching, their faces hardening as Whitman's venom spilled out unchecked. He could see it in their eyes. They were beginning to glimpse the truth, to see the man behind the title. But David wasn't done. He had one final card to play, and the moment had come to lay it on the table. "Dr. Whitman," he said, his voice steady, but laced with a gravity that silenced the room. "There's someone else you need to hear from." He gestured toward the door, and it swung open with a soft creak. Clara stepped inside, her presence a quiet storm of strength and sorrow. She held her head high, her dark hair falling in loose waves around her shoulders, but her eyes redrimmed and fierce betrayed the depth of her pain. The room seemed to shrink as she walked forward, her footsteps deliberate, her gaze locked on Whitman. She stopped beside David, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them in front of her. But her voice was unwavering when she spoke. "Dr. Whitman," she began, her tone calm yet charged with an intensity that vibrated through the walls. "You took something from me I can never reclaim. You took my son, me baby boy I held in my arms, who you decided wasn't good enough to be mine. Whitman's face tightened, a shadow of something sinister flickering in his eyes. He straightened in his chair, attempting to muster his usual air of control. But Clara's words crashed against him like waves against a crumbling cliff. "You looked me in the eye," she continued, her voice growing stronger, sharper. "And you spoke to me like I was nothing, like I was dirt beneath your shoes. You treated my family like we were trespassers in your perfect little kingdom. And when I begged you for answers, when I pleaded to know where my child was, you laughed loud in my face, knowing exactly what you'd done." Whitman opened his mouth, a retort forming on his lips, but David cut him off, his voice rising with a force he could no longer contain. "You manipulated these mothers, Whitman. You convinced them they were unfit, that they didn't deserve their own children. And then you ripped their babies away. How many lives have you shattered? How many women like Clara have you humiliated, thinking your power made you untouchable?" Harris shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor, but David didn't flinch, his eyes boring into Whitman's. The doctor's composure was unraveling, his hands gripping the edge of the table as if to anchor himself. Then, from the far end of the table, Mrs. Aldridge, an elderly board member with silver hair pinned neatly in a bun, leaned forward. She'd been silent throughout, her weathered hands folded in her lap. But now her voice cut through the chaos, firm and unyielding. "Dr. Whitman," she said, her tone a quiet thunder that left no room for defiance. "I've served on this board for over 30 years. In all that time, I've never witnessed anything as sickening as what I've heard today." Whitman's face paled, his bravado draining away as Mrs. Aldridge's piercing gaze pinned him in place. "You're a doctor," she continued, her voice steady but laced with disgust, "entrusted with the care and dignity of every soul who enters this hospital. But you've betrayed that trust. You've stained St. Catherine's name, and worse, you've trampled the very values we're built upon." Whitman stammered, his voice faltering. "Mrs. Aldridge, with all due respect, this is..." She raised a hand, her expression like iron. "There's no excuse for what you've done, Dr. Whitman. Effective immediately, you are relieved of your duties, pending a full investigation." Shock twisted Whitman's features, his mouth gaping as rage flared in his eyes. He glanced around the room, searching for an ally, but the silence was a guillotine, swift and final. Harris tugged at his sleeve, whispering frantically, but Whitman yanked his arm away, his glare settling on David and Clara. "You think you've won, don't you?" he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "You think this is the end?" David met his stare, unflinching. "It's the end for you, Whitman. You've preyed on these families for too long. Now you'll answer for it." Whitman lurched to his feet, his hands shaking as he gathered his papers and coat. He cast one final, seething look at David before turning on his heel and storming out, the sound of his footsteps reverberating down the hallway like the last echoes of a fallen empire. The room fell still, the weight of the confrontation settling over them like a dense fog. David turned to Clara, his hand reaching for hers. She gripped it tightly, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek, but her eyes shone with a fierce, unbroken spirit. Together, they stood in the aftermath, the air thick with the promise of justicing the bitter reminder that power, when abused, inevitably meets its reckoning. The boardroom had emptied out slowly, its heavy wooden doors swinging shut behind the last of the departing members. Their footsteps echoed faintly down the marble hallway of St. Catherine's, a place that once gleamed with sterile pride, but now felt like a hollow shell, stripped of its illusions. Clara and David lingered near the long mahogany table, its surface still littered with papers and coffee cups, remnants of a battle that had stretched over months, maybe years. They didn't need words in that moment. A glance between them carried the weight of everything they'd endured. The fight had been brutal, a relentless clawing through layers of lies and betrayal. But they'd done it, they'd ripped the mask off the truth. For the first time in what felt like forever, a fragile hope flickered in their chests, a chance to mend the jagged pieces of their lives. Yet, as they stepped into the corridor, leaving behind the room that had suffocated them with its secrets, one question gnawed at their souls like a splinter under the skin. Where was their son? The air outside the boardroom felt colder, heavier, as if it carried the echoes of every whispered conspiracy that had once filled those walls. Clara's shoulders slumped under an invisible burden, her hazel eyes tracing the intricate patterns of the floor tiles, as though they might reveal some hidden answer. David walked beside her, his jaw tight, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn jacket. They'd won a victory. Whitman, the man who'd orchestrated their nightmare, had been exposed, his title stripped away like a badge torn from a disgraced soldier. The board had seen the evidence, heard the testimonies, and cast him out. But the triumph was hollow, overshadowed by the gaping void where their child should have been. That ache pulsed in Clara's chest, a relentless rhythm of loss that hadn't dulled since the day her newborn was taken from her arms. She stopped abruptly, her breath catching, and turned to David. Her voice, when it came, was raw, trembling with a grief that had festered too long. "David," she said, her words slicing through the silence, "we might have ruined his career, shattered everything he built, but he still holds the one piece of us we can't live without. He knows where our son is, and until we find him," she couldn't finish. Her gaze drifted, unfocused, lost in the memory of tiny fingers curling around hers, of a soft cry that still haunted her dreams. David halted mid-step, his heart twisting at the sight of her pain. He turned to face her fully, his broad shoulders softening as he reached for her hands. Her fingers were cold, trembling, and he enveloped them in his own, squeezing gently as if he could pour his strength into her. "Clara," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him, "I swear to you, we will find him, no matter how long it takes, no matter what I have to do, bring him back to us." His words wavered at the end, a crack in his armor revealing the fear he'd buried beneath his resolve. He wasn't just promising her, he was promising himself, clinging to the vow as a lifeline. They both understood the next step wouldn't be easy. Whitman hadn't just slunk away and defeat vanished, a shadow slipping through the cracks of the city after his humiliation. But David wasn't alone in this. He had people friends in dark corners, contacts in law enforcement, men and women who owed him favors from years past. He'd call on every single one if it meant getting their son back. The days that followed blurred into a relentless grind. David barely slept, his eyes bloodshot as he hunched over his phone in their small, dimly lit apartment. The kitchen table became his war room, strewn with scribbled notes, maps, and half-empty mugs of cold coffee. He dialed numbers late into the night, his voice low and urgent as he pressed old allies for any scrap of information. Clara watched him from the doorway, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her own exhaustion warring with a fierce pride in his determination. She'd catch herself staring at the empty crib in the corner of their living room, its pastel blankets untouched, gathering dust. Each unanswered call tightened the knot in her stomach, but she refused to break it yet. It was on a rainy afternoon a week later that a lifeline appeared. David met an old friend, Detective Mark Hensley, in a cramped downtown cafe. The place smelled of burnt coffee and damp coats, its windows streaked with rivulets of water. Mark, a weary man with graying hair and a perpetual frown, slid into the booth across from David. Without a word, he pushed a grainy photograph across the chipped tabletop. The image was blurry, taken from a distance, but there was no mistaking Whitman's sharp featureless, angular jaw, the cold glint in his eye standing outside a dilapidated building in a forgotten part of town. David's pulse quickened as he studied the photo, his fingers tracing the edges as if he could pull Whitman out of it. "He's been seen here," Mark said, his voice a low rumble, barely audible over the clatter of dishes in the background. "Some rundown spot on the east side. He's careful. Thaw knows he's got a target on his back now. Won't be a walk in the park to get close." David nodded, his throat tight. "Thanks, Mark. This is enough to start with." He didn't linger, there was no time. That evening, he and Clara piled into their battered sedan, the engine sputtering as they drove through the drizzle to the address Mark had given them. They parked a block away, the building looming ahead like a relic of a forgotten era. Its brick facade was crumbling, stained with years of neglect, and the windows were dark, some boarded up, others cracked. Shadows seemed to cling to the walls, and the air hung thick with a stillness that set Clara's nerves on edge. David reached for her hand as they stepped out of the car, his grip firm, a silent vow that he wouldn't let her face this alone. Inside, the building was a maze of dim corridors, the air stale and tinged with mildew. Flickering fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting long, jittery shadows. They moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by a threadbare carpet that had once been red, but was now a mottled gray. Voices drifted from somewhere deeper within, a low murmur that grew clearer. As they neared a closed door at the end of the hall, Clara's grip on David's hand tightened, her knuckles whitening as her breath hitched. "This is it," she whispered, her voice so faint it barely reached him. He nodded, his own heart hammering against his ribs, and with a steadying breath, he pushed the door open. The room beyond was small and cluttered, a makeshift office drowning in stacks of papers and overturned furniture. And there, behind a scarred wooden desk, sat Dr. Whitman. His head snapped up at the intrusion, his sharp eyes widening for a split second before narrowing into something colder, more calculated. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms with a deliberate slowness, a sneer curling his lips. Well, he drawled, his voice oily with contempt. "If it isn't the Thompsons. To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" Clara stepped forward, her legs trembling, but her spine rigid with a fury she'd nursed for too long. "Where's he, Whitman?" she demanded, her voice quaking yet laced with steel. "Where's my son?" The question hung in the air, sharp and desperate, and Whitman's response was a laugh, harsh, grating, a sound that scraped against the silence like nails on a chalkboard. "Your son," he mocked, tilting his head as if genuinely amused. "What makes you think you have any claim to him? A child like that deserves better than the likes of you." David's hands balled into fists, his knuckles cracking as rage surged through him. He took a step closer, his voice low and lethal. "You don't get to decide that. He's our Sir Sonnen. You tore him away from us. You had no right." Whitman's smirk faded, his gaze hardening into something venomous. "Oh, David," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "You think the world bends to your naive little notions of fairness? Some people are simply more fit to raise a child. I did him a favor, spared him a life with you." Clara's face twisted, a storm of agony and anger warring across her features. "A favor," she spat, her voice breaking as tears welled in her eyes. "You ripped my baby from my arms, stole every moment I should have had with him. And you call that a favor?" Her hands shook at her sides, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to keep from lunging at him. Whitman shrugged, unmoved, his expression as cold as the concrete walls around them. "You're too emotional, Clara too weak to see the bigger picture. I've been in this game long enough to know what's best for certain types." David's patience snapped. He leaned forward, his voice slicing through the air like a blade. "And where is he now, Whitman? What better place did you send him to? You've convinced yourself you're some kind of savior, but all you've done is shatter Livzers, and who knows how many others." Whitman's eyes gleamed with a twisted pride, a flicker of defiance dancing in their depths. "You can preach all you want about right and wrong," he said, his voice rising with a strange fervor, "but I had the authority to make those calls. I gave children like yours a chance at something greater, something they'd never get from parents like you." He paused, his gaze locking onto Clara with a cruel smirk. "Mothers like you." David lunged forward, his fists trembling, but Clara's hand shot out, gripping his arm to hold him back. Her voice, though shaky, was fierce as she demanded, "Tell me where he is." Whitman studied her for a long, agonizing moment, then leaned forward, his tone thick with disdain. "You want the truth? Fine. Your son's with a family who can give him what you never could: wealth, influence, a name that means something. He's better off." The words hit Clara like a physical blow, her knees buckling as tears spilled down her cheeks. She pictured her baby, her little boy with his father's dark hair, and her wide eyes shanded off, like a trophy to strangers. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, a plea wrapped in heartbreak. "Why would you do this to us?" Whitman's expression darkened, a glint of something sinister flashing in his eyes. "Because I could," he said simply, his voice chillingly calm. "Because people like you don't belong in a place like St. Catherine's. It's not complicated." David's control shattered. He surged forward, his face inches from Whitman's, his voice a guttural growl. "You're a monster. You've torn apart families, destroyed everything good. And for what? Some sick fantasy of playing God." Whitman didn't flinch, meeting David's fury with an icy stare. "Call me what you want," he said, "but I acted for the greater good. Your son's safer from you, where he belongs." Clara's hands shook violently, her grief warring with a rising tide of resolve. She steadied herself, wiping her tears with a trembling hand, and fixed Whitman with a look that could have burned through steel. "You think this ends here?" she said, her voice low and deadly. "You think we'll just walk away and let you keep what you've stolen?" Whitman chuckled, a sound as cold as the wind rattling the broken windows. "I've been at this for decades, Clara. You're not the first to come at me with tears and threats. They all give up eventually, realize they're nothing against me." David's response was a whisper, but it carried the weight of a promise carved in stone. "Not us, Whitman. We're different. This time, you've met your match, for the first time." A shadow of doubt flickered across Whitman's face, his smug facade cracking as he registered the unyielding fire in their eyes. Clara drew a deep, shuddering breath, her voice soft but resolute. "We'll find him, Whitman. No matter where you've stashed him, no matter who you've bribed or bullied into keeping him. We'll bring our son home, and you'll all pay for every life you've ruined, every tear you've caused. Justice isn't just a word to us, it's a reckoning, and it's coming for you." Whitman's confidence faltered, his mouth opening as if to retort, but no sound came. The room filled with a suffocating silence, thick with the tension of a storm about to break. David pulled Clara into his arms, his embrace a shield against the darkness they'd faced. As they turned to leave, he cast one final look over his shoulder, his eyes locking with Whitman's. "This isn't over," he said, his voice a quiet thunder. "Not until every abuse of power you've wielded crumbles, and you're left with nothing but the consequences." The door creaked shut behind them, but the echo of their words lingered, a testament to a fight that was far from finished, a fight for their son, for justice, and for the unshakable truth that power, when twisted, always meets its end. "Apart what you've built with him," Clara continued, her voice thick with emotion. "We just want him to know us, to know where he came from. We've lost so much time already, and all we want is a chance to love him too." Mr. Randall nodded slowly, his expression a mix of sorrow and resolve. "He's a happy boy," he said quietly. "He's for now, full of energy, always asking questions. We've given him everything we could. But if what you're saying is true, if Whitman lied to us and he deserves to know you, we'll need time to process this, to figure out how to tell him." David squeezed Clara's hand under the table, a silent acknowledgement of the fragile hope blossoming between them. "We understand," he said. "This isn't about taking him away from you. It's about giving him the truth, and maybe, in time, a bigger family. We're willing to work with you however long it takes." The room fell silent again, the weight of their shared pain and tentative trust settling over them. Mrs. Randall wiped a tear from her cheek and stood. Would you like to see him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's playing in the backyard." Clara's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening as she looked at David. He nodded, his own emotions barely held in check. "Yes," Clara managed to say, her voice trembling with anticipation. "Please." Mrs. Randall led them through the house, each step feeling like an eternity to Clara. They passed framed photos on the wall, snapshots of a little boy with dark hair and bright eyes, laughing, running, growing up in a home filled with love. Clara's heart ached at the sight, a bittersweet mix of joy and grief swirling within her. This was her son, living a life she'd never known, yet safe and cared for in a way she'd prayed for during every sleepless night. They stepped outside onto a small porch, where the sound of a child's laughter carried through the air. There he was, a small figure darting across the grass, chasing a soccer ball with boundless energy. Clara froze, her hand flying to her mouth as tears spilled down her cheeks. He was beautiful, so alive, so much like the baby she'd held in her arms before he was torn away. "That's Ethan," Mrs. Randall said softly, watching Clara and David with a mix of empathy and protectiveness. "That's what we named him." "Ethan," Clara whispered, the name settling into her heart like a missing piece. She took a tentative step forward, then stopped, unsure of how to approach, how to bridge the years that separated them. David placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. "We'll take it slow," he murmured, "one step at a time." Mrs. Randall called out to the boy, "Ethan, come here for a minute, sweetie." The child turned. His curiosity piqued and trotted over, his cheeks flushed from play. He stopped in front of them, tilting his head as he studied the strangers with wide, innocent eyes. "Ethan," Mrs. Randall said gently, kneeling beside him, "these are some friends of ours. They wanted to meet you." Clara crouched down to his level, her heart pounding as she took in every detail of his face, the curve of his nose, the spark in his eyes, the way his hair fell just like David's. "Hi, Ethan," she said, her voice soft and trembling. "You're so big. And you look like you're really good at soccer." Ethan grinned shyly, clutching the ball under his arm. "I can kick it really far," he said proudly, glancing at Mrs. Randall for confirmation. "He can," Mr. Randall chimed in with a small smile. "He's got a strong leg." David knelt beside Clara, his voice warm. "Maybe you can show us sometime," he said. "We'd love to see it." Ethan nodded enthusiastically, then darted off again, calling over his shoulder, "Okay, watch me." He kicked the ball with surprising force, sending it rolling across the yard. Clara watched him, tears streaming silently down her face as she felt the first flicker of connection a thread tying her to this little boy who didn't yet know the full story of his life. She turned to the Randalls, her voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you for letting us see him, for raising him so well." Mrs. Randall's eyes softened. "He's our world," she said simply, "but we'll figure this out together, for him." That evening, as Clara and David drove home, the silence between them was differentless heavy, infused with a cautious hope. They didn't have all the answers yet. There would be legal battles, emotional challenges, and a long road ahead to build a relationship with Ethan and the Randalls. But for the first time in years, Clara felt a sense of possibility, a belief that they could heal the wounds Whitman had inflicted. David reached for her hand, his voice quiet but firm. "We found him, Clara. He's safe, he's loved, and now we get to love him too." Clara nodded, squeezing his hand as she stared out the window at the fading light. "We'll bring him home," she whispered, "not just to the house they lived in, but to the space in their hearts that had been empty for so long. One way or another, we'll bring him home." Their fight wasn't over, but it had shifted from a desperate search for their son to a careful, determined effort to weave themselves into his life. Whitman's shadow still loomed, his network still a threat to uncover. But Clara and David had each other, and now they had Ethan. That was enough to keep them going, step by step, toward the family they'd always dreamed of. This is a gripping and emotional narrative about Clara and David Thompson's relentless pursuit to reclaim their son, stolen from them by the manipulative and prejudiced Dr. Whitman. It's a story that weaves together themes of love, justice, resilience, and the complexity of family bonds forged through both blood and circumstance. The journey takes them from the depths of despair uncovering the truth about Whitman's cruel actions, to a bittersweet triumph as they reunite with their son and form an unexpected alliance with the Randalls, the family who had raised him. The tale doesn't shy away from the raw pain of loss, or the moral ambiguity of confronting a man like Whitman, who justifies his monstrous deeds with a twisted sense of superiority. Yet, it also shines with hope, showing how Clara and David's unwavering love, paired with their refusal to let bitterness define them, ultimately leads to healing not just for themselves, but for their son and even the Randalls. The legal reckoning of Whitman adds a satisfying layer of justice, exposing his crimes and giving voice to other families he harmed, while the story's focus remains on the personal victories of compassion and connection. Your narrative ends with a powerful reflection, inviting the reader to consider their own responses to betrayal, loss, and the pursuit of justice. It's a call to empathy and strength, leaving a lasting impression about the transformative power of love over hate. Since you've shared this story without a specific question, I'll assume you might want feedback or a response to it. If I've misunderstood, please let me know how I can assist further. Here's my take. This is a beautifully crafted story that balances intense emotion with a thoughtful resolution. The characters feel real. Clara's quiet resolve, David's protective determination, and even Whitman's chilling arrogance are all vivid and compelling. The pacing keeps the tension alive, especially in the confrontation scene. While the resolution offers a nuanced look at what family can mean in the aftermath of trauma, the reflective ending is a strong touch, engaging the reader directly and encouraging introspection. If you're looking for ways to refine it, one suggestion might be tightening some of the longer passages, e.g., the build-up to finding Whitman, to heighten the suspense. Additionally, a few more specific details about the son like a quirks or habit schooled make his presence even more tangible when they reunite, but overall it's a moving and impactful piece. What inspired you to write this, or what would you like me to do with it next? Analyze it further, summarize it, or something else? Let me know.